Well, good morning. We are ready to start. Good morning, folks here in person. Hello to folks on the live stream or watching the video later. It's a quick transition today from the early service to this, so you might see folks coming in. Feel free, if you're in the back, to point them to where chairs are. There's a couple up front here. This is, again, the next in our series of Who Do You Say I Am? Encountering the Newer Testament. And today we are making a bit of a jump from, we've been talking a lot about the Gospels, a lot about the life of Jesus, and now we're switching into the Apostle Paul, and a lot of his writings are to come the rest of this year and then into early 2025. We'll take one break during Advent to come back to the Gospels and talk about incarnation in terms of, what does it mean to talk about Jesus as both divine and human? As the Gospels present him, we felt that was kind of fitting for the Advent season. So that'll be coming on December 14th, I think. But we're going to get started. Margaret is with the officer training class today, so just me, so be kind. As always, some announcements to get started. There's, I think, a really fine interview with Beverly Gaventa on the Apostle Paul that's on the adult education website, so I commend that to you. That will take you deeper into some topics and more broadly into some topics that I can't cover today, so I recommend that. Also on the adult education webpage, just so you know, you can find recordings of previous presentations. Perhaps you missed, perhaps you were ill, perhaps you were doing yard work, perhaps you just thought there was something more important than being here at 9:15. I totally get that. But I bring this up this week. Margaret and I were really pleased, impressed, moved by some of the depth of conversation last week in particular, when we talked a bit about what does this kingdom of God or reign of God language mean, especially in light of the election and kind of how the church is taking its bearings about who we are and what kind of world we live in and what our priorities should be. And the first 10 minutes of that I thought were gold. It was largely when all of you were talking. So if you missed last week, I highly recommend that. Third announcement, this is brand new. In the back by the door, there's a red box. It's one of my old shoe boxes, but, cleaned up, neatened up. And it's our suggestion box, the red box by the door, or question box. So Margaret and I have accumulated some questions over the last 2 months about things we haven't been able to cover or areas where people would like a little bit more depth or a little bit more, drilling down deep into some particular topics that we've skipped over either intentionally or unintentionally. So this is like a suggestion box. There's some 3x5 cards back there, some pens, totally anonymous. We can't guarantee we'll get to everything, but we're trying just to collect where are the gaps and where are the points of interest that we haven't touched on, and maybe sometime in the spring or maybe during the winter we'll find ways to come back to that. So do visit the red box by the back door. And that'll be making a return appearance from week to week as well, just so you know. All right, those are the announcements for the common good. A good place to start with thinking about Paul is to think about maps and to think about just really the extent of the Christian message, the Christian movement. With Jesus and the Gospels, we are almost entirely limited, I guess, or situated just above Jerusalem there, where Jesus was in Galilee. It appears that he spends all of his life there. He never ventures too far as we can tell from the Gospels. He is a Jew living in Galilee and has some interactions with people who are passing through, but for the most part is very, very localized. When we got to the book of Acts, this map is really the scope of the book of Acts, at least all of it ends here in Rome. So there's action here in parts of Italy. Most of the action takes place in Greece and Macedonia, and then this area where it says Galatia. This is modern Turkey, what the ancients referred to as Asia Minor. A lot of action there, as well as some stuff in Jerusalem and Damascus. So it's after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus that the church starts to move out or is pushed out or is propelled outward. And Acts tracks some of that, but we also see that again in Paul's letters. And what I want you to get a sense for is it's not just geographic expansion, not just more land, more people, but what we see in Paul's letters is also some cultural expansion or some cultural widening. Not everybody was the same in the Roman-controlled world. Right? The cultures were different in place to place. Concerns were different. Religion was different. There were a lot of commonalities in terms of social norms. But Paul is somebody who, in many ways, takes the gospel across borders. He's not the only one. He's one of many people who are doing similar work. But in these decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus, we see really some remarkable expansion of the church. And so as we turn to the Apostle Paul, maybe the most famous of the early followers of Jesus, I want you to get a sense for how Paul's story is wrapped up in the story of the church's wide expanse, but also the church's wide welcome and the growing diversity that we see in ancient Christianity. Paul is part of the church's answer to the question, what does the story of Jesus, what does the story about Jesus mean, not just for Jews in Galilee, but for the wider world? And from a Roman perspective, this essentially was the world, right? This is the Gospels kind of inhabit that Roman perspective. But pretty much almost every bit of land you see on this map was under Roman control in the first century, and in fact, even more. The Roman Empire was brutal in terms of its enforcing its norms, right? If you strayed too far away from the center line, you would be punished. But Rome also created a context in which travel was relatively easy, relatively inexpensive, relatively safe, and the mixing and matching of cultures was also quite possible. So it was this fortuitous context for Paul to do his work. When we think about Paul, like who in the world are we talking about? How do we even get at the question of this Paul person? There's a number of sources that we might consult, right? First and foremost, this is historical work. How do we know about Paul? Well, in the New Testament, we have letters that Paul wrote, or more likely that he dictated. This was how letters were written in the ancient world. You had professional scribes who would write. Sounds great. You could just kind of pace around the kitchen and talk, and somebody would write down what you said. Occasionally, Paul's scribe in the book of Romans, Paul's scribe introduces himself. In the last verses says, I, Tertius, who write this letter, also send my greetings. It's like, Paul's like, Tertius, you get one sentence, whatever you want. So some of this is dictation, perhaps. Paul has a secretary of sorts or a scribe. We also see letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, but possibly that might have been written by somebody else. More on that in just a minute. There's also the Acts of the Apostles, which we talked about, I think it's now 4 weeks ago, 3-4 weeks ago. And this has a lot to say about Paul. He is one of the main characters in the book. About the second half of the book of Acts tracks Paul. The narrative lens, so to speak, stays on him for almost all of the second half of the book of Acts. And we see places he goes, people he associates with, trouble he gets himself into, and so on. The Acts of the Apostles was not written by Paul. It was written a while after his death, and there are debates among scholars about how much it might or might not embellish or exaggerate, or Beverly Gaventa in her video calls it amplify, aspects of Paul. But it's another source we have for him. We also have later writings about Paul, Christian writings from the end of the first century, around the year 100, into the second and third century, where we're able to look at what people are saying about Paul's legacy, how he was remembered as a teacher, as a model of faith, and things like that. So we can start to track kind of the way Paul stuck around in people's minds and people's thought after his death. We also have quite a bit of evidence that helps us reconstruct his world. We have literature, we have archaeological digs, we've got all sorts of things that help us understand more of what it means for Paul to have been a Jew, a Greek-speaking Jew, one who's able to travel, one who is able to get an audience in the various places he goes, one who finds himself in legal trouble, one who finds himself in all sorts of controversy. It helps us kind of get a sense of the world in which Paul lived, which helps us test hypotheses about what we read about Paul. This is all like on the table when we think about Paul, but it also raises the question of what in the world are we looking for, right? Or who in the world are we looking for when we talk about Paul? There are a whole bunch of Pauls we might try to recover. If you want to know aspects of his life, like to write a biography, there's not a ton of information. If you want to know what he thought, what he taught, we have the letters that he wrote. Those are the best way into his mind, although then again, it's really only a handful of letters. How would you feel if 2,000 years from now people found, a dozen of your emails and tried to reconstruct your whole thought based on that, right? It's a little scary, right? We're trying to get a sense of who was he as a teacher. And a lot of these letters, a lot of these emails are written in moments of crisis. Some of them are written to people Paul knows very, very well and appears to be very familiar with. Some of them are written to people that he doesn't know, and so he's a little more diplomatic in those letters. So how do you suss out the differences in the way in which you speak? We're never going to get to the bottom of exactly who was Paul, but we can get a sense of the kinds of things that were important to him, the kinds of things that made him influential, the kinds of people who associated with him, and the kinds of people who were upset at him. There's also the Paul of Christian tradition, how the church has remembered Paul, which is, of course, partly legendary, partly accurate, like any traditions, right? Full of some emphases and some oversights that are always in need of correction. I want to focus mostly on Paul's letters, because there we have things actually from the apostle's mouth, or from his pen, so to speak, where we can see how he was actually interacting with other audiences. It's fun to read letters. We're literally reading somebody else's mail, right? This is interesting. We know that some of these other people wrote to him or had means of communicating with him. We've lost all of that. So we only have one side of the conversation, which, you used to say that's like listening to somebody on the phone, which was kind of a humorous thing. Now, of course, with cell phones, right, we're constantly submitted to one side of everybody's conversations, right? You've ever been in, an airport waiting lounge or something like that, and you learn all about somebody's business that you didn't really want to know about, but only from one side of the story. So question for you then, and I just want kind of quick feedback on this. We're not going to necessarily break up into conversations, but what are some things you know about Paul, in particular details of his life? The piece of art here might be one hint for one of those things. Claire's going to circulate with the microphone. That helps the folks online know what's happening here in the room. Folks online can use the chat feature. We've got somebody watching that. What are some things you know about Paul, if anything? Could be right, could be wrong. We'll test all these things.
He was a later believer.
Later believer. He was not one of Jesus' original followers, correct? Not part of that group.
He was a Roman citizen, which is unusual for the time.
Roman citizen. The book of Acts, he claims Roman citizenship a couple of times, which in later centuries, the Romans gave away citizenship like candy. It was a helpful way to win friends and influence people. But if indeed Paul did possess that legal status, that was a big deal, especially for somebody like him who lived in the East, rather far from Rome, which might suggest he came from an influential family. So, Jennifer.
And he had a thorn of some kind.
He did. He tells us he had something he calls a thorn in the flesh that was given to him to torment him and to remind him of his weakness. And nobody knows what he was talking about. This could have been something physical or psychological or spiritual. Who knows? Yeah.
Is there any evidence that he's ethnically Jew?
Did you say uniquely Jew? Or?
Is there any evidence that proves that he is ethnically Jew?
That he's ethnically Jewish? Yes. I mean, he tells us that he was. He tells us he was a member. He even knows his tribe. He says, I'm a member of the tribe of Benjamin. And so he's got strong bona fides. He's got a great reputation as a zealous Jew. We'll talk about that some more in a few minutes for sure.
Off the chat line.
Yeah.
One of our members says Paul was in prison at Caesarea.
He was imprisoned. It appears numerous times, sometimes short period of time, sometimes longer. Writes some of his letters from prison.
He had a very dramatic conversion experience.
Very dramatic conversion experience. Part of that's depicted here. Fun fact, this is great for cocktail parties. You almost always traditionally you see Paul riding a horse. There's no mention of him being on an animal in the book of Acts during his conversion, but all over the place you always see a horse. So this is what happens in church tradition. Paul knocked off his horse, his high horse, some would say. Dramatic conversion experience. We'll come back to that in a minute in some more detail.
He persecuted Christians.
He persecuted Christians.
Yes.
Prior to his conversion, his experience, he was not only opposed to the church, but was also actively going about trying to snuff it out. He talks about that repeatedly. Acts talks about that repeatedly. It's kind of part of his self-understanding that never goes away.
When we say he persecuted Christian, do we means the Nazarene, the first Jewish sect?
Yeah, there's one point in Acts where he talks about the sect of the Nazarenes, and in this case, he's talking about people who were followers of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, follower of Jesus, and they keep upholding the law of the Torah, and they follow James, the brother of the Lord.
Yeah, so there's differences about kind of which branch of the early church is law obedient or Torah obedient, which ones are not, and which names different ones might have. We have to remember that in the first century, that word Christian or Christianity really doesn't exist. This is kind of a later development, and so what to call the church is always a bit of a challenge. So we see sect of the Nazarenes, the church. Acts tries to call the church the Way, capital W, as well. Where there's only a couple of mentions of that word Christian, and where it does show up, it appears to be a term that's used derisively, right? Oh, those Christ people, and Christians like that and picked up on it, right? Something similar happened like with the Quakers and the Shakers, right? Those were originally terms of derision, and they said, yeah, we'll take those. All right, a lot of good things there, right? Paul made his living by being a leather worker. Sometimes tent maker is how that's translated. He had a trade, something he could do with his hands, something that made him mobile, able to pick up and do business in various places. A widespread traveler. He appears to have remained unmarried. We don't know if he was married at one point in time, but he talks about his celibacy in one of his letters. A lot of little details about Paul. Claire, you're up again. Yeah, sorry. You're rehydrating. You're ready? Good. Different question than moving away kind of his life and more toward his legacy. And here, just using an adjective or two, how would you characterize your impression of Paul, if you have one? Everybody has impressions of Paul, and they tend to run a gamut.
He's a theologian.
Theologian.
Yes, he explains what God is doing in creation and history.
There's a lot to say about what God is doing, right, in creation and history. Even when he's giving advice to the churches, excuse me, the tone of that is less, this is good manners or this is good behavior, but rather, this is what a church shaped by the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ should look like. Right? So very much kind of taking his bearings from who God is. Yeah, in the back.
I see him as single-minded, passionate, ultimately devoted, and difficult.
All good adjectives. Single-minded, passionate, there's one other in there, and difficult. Difficult to read and understand, and perhaps difficult to get along with, right? Is that fair? Okay. He has the zeal of a convert throughout his life and his writings, and that comes across.
I mean this as no insult, maybe ADHD.
No insult, maybe has ADHD in terms of his... It's a gift in some settings, of course, as well, right?
Not a fan of Paul, however, because of his misogyny. But he also talks about disciples who are women, and he stays with women, and he praises some women in the course of his life. But the parts of Paul that are misogynistic have been taken by some members of the church. My grandmother's church was one, who Paul said women should not speak in church. They got to not put pearls in their hair, all that stuff. And, you know, that's just crabby. That's not necessary.
It is, right? So if you don't know, there's this yes, but there's a one side and the other with Paul. There is, and we'll talk about this in a bit. There is evidence that Paul is part of a network of men and women who are in public leadership positions. And there's also a couple of passages, in some cases just a verse or two, where Paul says things that appear to forbid women's participation in leadership that have been certainly gotten more attention than it appears Paul had situated them, right? So the way in which Paul's influence has been felt in the church has largely been around exclusion, right? And exclusion based on gender norms and just some assumptions about what it means to be male or female. And the church has, of course, had a hard time shaking that, if it's even tried. Mark.
I've always been fascinated by his efforts to reconcile his commitment to Judaism with the new revelation that he's encountering and promoting, that he does maintain a respect for both in ways that often seem, shall we say, difficult to comprehend, but good effort.
Yeah, good. A for effort. There's Paul is Jewish. We'll talk about this some more in a minute. Remains Jewish throughout his life, even after converting or turning to follow Jesus. Today, we would say that's not possible. Most Jews today, not all, but most Jews today would say if you become a believer in Jesus, you're no longer Jewish. That's the dividing line. In Paul's day, a little different because all the church is Jewish, but Paul is trying to both hold on to his own Jewish commitments and make space for non-Jews, for Gentiles, and is very visible at a time in the church's history where this self-definition is taking place. And one question is, can he pull it off or not, right? Can he make room for Gentiles and make room for his faith in Christ without sounding as though he's abolishing Judaism or walking away from Judaism or somehow dismissing Judaism? Yeah, Tim.
Additional perspective off the chat line. A member says, Paul was empathetic to the early Christians in various places who were attempting to learn about and follow Jesus, but who struggled.
We'll see that, right? None of his letters are all different. And so next week, Margaret's going to start with two of his letters that are some of the most open-hearted, loving, generous, two churches that he appears to have great relationships with. There's just great fondness back and forth. Then I'll come back December 1st and we'll look at Galatians, where he's just furious with these people. I mean, imagine that, right? This happens in our lives. So, which of your letters do you want found 2,000 years from now? So there is some of that. And some of these churches are perhaps tiny. We think of church and we don't think about the building you're in now. Think about somebody's living room where there's maybe a dozen people who are gathered, right, in all of a city or something like that. And some of these churches are having a really difficult time. Some are perhaps suffering some kind of outcast status from the wider community. Some of them are just trying to figure out, how am I supposed to share space if I'm, say, a well-to-do merchant and there's enslaved people and children in this community, and I'm supposed to live in a non-hierarchical community with them? That goes against everything the Roman Empire and all these Roman social norms have taught me. So how Paul flattens those aspects of privilege is always a delicate dance in his letters. Yeah. Good. There's a lot, and if you come in thinking, I don't know a thing about Paul, that's why I'm here, great. If you come in and you just despise Paul and can't believe we're actually even saying his name, great. We're used to that. If you love Paul and can't figure out what's the big idea, what's wrong with Paul? He's the best, isn't he? Right? And there's a lot of space to inhabit in between those extremes. Thanks, Claire. And so there's a lot of room and there's a lot of complexity with Paul, like there is with any human being, which makes it fun to study him and his influence and his legacy, and also sometimes maddening to do so. And add to that there's an intensity to Paul that some people are attracted to and some people find exhausting from time to time. To get to the bottom, or to get it maybe at the heart of some of the things things that drive Paul, I want to drop into something he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul's getting close to wrapping up this letter, and he says this: "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received." Here Paul is letting us know that he is in communication with the broader tradition. Paul is not somebody who's out there inventing a new religion on his own. He's now quoting from some traditional materials or perhaps some kind of an early confession, right? I handed on to you what was handed on to me, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas. This is the Aramaic equivalent to Peter. So when he says Cephas, he means Peter. Then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. The beginning of that statement might very well be an early Christian confession. It has a certain kind of rhythm to it. It might be something that was recited. So Paul's showing us he knows what other Christians are saying. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. A couple of things come out here. Paul reminds everybody of his former life as a persecutor. Paul talks about his own revelation of Jesus, talks about how Jesus, post-resurrection, revealed himself to his followers, some of his closest ones, but also to these 500 brothers and sisters at one time. We don't know exactly where that was or how that took place, or if that's something the book of Acts might mention, but that's significant. He also refers to himself as an apostle. The word apostle just means ambassador in the ancient world. It's not like a special Christian word, somebody who's a delegate sent to do work on somebody else's behalf. Paul appears to be using that term apostle to describe anybody who has seen the risen Jesus and perhaps been commissioned by him. So in Paul's view, there's at least 500 apostles who are out there. This idea of, and we don't know about really his life as a persecutor. We don't get a lot of detail about that. But what we see in this short quote here is that the heart of his calling isn't an intellectual choice to start to follow Jesus. But something happened to Paul. He has some kind of an encounter, some kind of an experience. Whether you want to call that some kind of an altered state of consciousness, or having received a vision of some kind of a mystical experience, right? Paul believes that the risen Jesus has appeared to him and has commissioned him to do some things. This is at the heart of a lot of his zeal, of a lot of his intensity. He really believes this, right? And if this ever happened to me, I suppose I would have a similar kind of intensity or single-mindedness, or I might perhaps look strange to the rest of you, right? If I believe that God has revealed something in particular to me. And so this is something that I think we need to remember with Paul. Beverly Gaventa in our video talks about Paul having to insist on his authority from time to time, and saying that sometimes we all have to do that, right? Sometimes when trying to persuade others, we all have to say, this is why I know something about this. This is why I'm an expert about this. This is the experience I had. This is why you should listen to me. And Paul does that frequently. And at the heart of it is this kind of an experience that he once had. In a different letter, in Galatians, he says a little bit more about this experience, or about his life prior to following Jesus. To the Galatians, he says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. In other words, I'm not preaching anything that I designed by myself, right? I didn't receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, right? The gospel, the content of his teaching. He says, I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. No seminary for Paul, right? He doesn't tell us how this happened. He doesn't say that all at once was his mind filled. Did Jesus appear to him like around the campfire once a night for a month and teach him? Like, he just doesn't tell us, like, what did this look like? Like, what happened? Is this Paul's way of saying, I just sat in a study for a couple of months and I think this is what God told me? I mean, he doesn't let us into the exact experience. The book of Acts describes something, but even that is a very short story. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. Why is a big question. He never tells us what it was about the church that he found offensive. Probably it has something to do with following a crucified Messiah. He probably thought this is both stupid, like for a Jewish sect to be followers of a criminal. This is going to look really bad to the Roman authorities that there's this Jewish group that is idolizing or heroizing or maybe even worshiping somebody who was put to death by the Roman state. Perhaps Paul just sees this as bad news for Roman-Jewish relations. We're not exactly sure. But he says he was trying to destroy it. I was advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. Now, Paul's going to say, I was really into persecuting. I was really into my own Jewish training and education. But when the one who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me, here he's talking about God, so that I might proclaim him, Jesus, the Son of God, among the Gentiles. Notice he sees a particular calling, right? His calling is to Gentiles. I did not confer with any human, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me. In other words, I didn't go to school. I didn't ask anybody. I didn't seek advice. I went into Arabia, and then afterwards I returned to Damascus. Would love to know what he did, where he was, how long, who he talked with. We get nothing like this, right? But he makes this point, I didn't go and learn this from the wider church. This somehow came to me. Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. And what I am telling you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. This is now kind of eastern part of Turkey. And I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea, where Jerusalem's located, that are in Christ, right? I didn't go to the epicenter. I didn't go to the heart of the Christian movement at that time. They only heard about me. The one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God because of me. In other words, I was a bit of an enigma to the establishment in the church, but I was doing what I thought I had to do. Then after 14 years, so after this first meeting with Peter and James, 14 years later, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up in response to a revelation. Again, there's this mystical element of Paul that a lot of church tradition often forgets because we place that theologian label on him. But Paul has some kind of a revelation. Then I laid before them, though only in a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles. In other words, I gave them my theology in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. That's the end of that slide. So just note some things, right? Paul sees himself as, in many ways, independent from the Jerusalem church, where Peter and the other apostles are mostly centered at this time. At the same time, we learn that he's doing ministry, and we'll learn later he's engaged with other people as he does it. There's a lot in that paragraph that I just read, and so I simplified it by putting it on a single slide. If you like timelines, you're in luck. You don't have to write all of this down. But Jesus' death and resurrection, we're not sure exactly when, somewhere between the years 30 and 33. Paul's transformation, probably within 1 to 4 years after that. So the church is still very young, almost entirely Jewish, if not still entirely Jewish, when Paul becomes a convert. Probably mostly centered in Jerusalem, but maybe starting to spread out a little bit, like into Syria. Paul tells us he goes to Arabia after his transformation for 3 years, or Arabia and then Damascus in Syria for 3 years. Then he takes a short visit to Jerusalem to see Peter and James. He's only there 15 days, not enough time to learn too much is the assumption there. Then he does ministry in Syria and Cilicia, again, where Turkey meets Syria and Lebanon today. And he's there for 14 years, so a significant amount of time. Goes back to Jerusalem. And then he continues, we know this from other letters, but he begins where he's part of an itinerant ministry in Asia Minor, right, modern Turkey, Macedonia. There's a Macedonia today, but the northern part of what's today Greece, and then Greece itself. So remember back the map I showed at the beginning. His final arrest probably occurs sometime between the years 55 and 58. He's arrested multiple times, but in terms of his last arrest, probably around then. And then other sources, no biblical sources, but other sources tell us he was executed in Rome or near Rome during the reign of Nero in the early 60s. How old is he when he's transformed? Anywhere between probably 14 and 30. Just really hard to tell, right? I mean, from a Jewish perspective, would be considered a man at age 14 and well educated. Right? Different culture. Paul's most widespread, like geographically widespread ministry probably happens between the years 47 and 48, so sometime after he's kind of got going, where he feels like it's his calling now to travel to new places and to spread the gospel there. And the letters that we have probably come from between the range of around 50 to 62. We've got letters that really only cover about a decade of his life, of his career. In other words, what we know from what he says to the Galatians is he's got a much more significant ministry and life and influence than what the church remembers, right? Than what we have through his letters and through things like the book of Acts. We really know very little about Paul other than what he tells us. Church tradition has exploded that, has amplified that, has made it a lot bigger. But if we're just reading his letters, we know very little about him. So what's crucial then to note here? A couple of things. So we've talked about this. He was Jewish and he remained Jewish. He didn't see that as a contradiction to his faith in Jesus. Even more so, prior to his encounter with Jesus Christ, he was pretty happy being Jewish. He was pretty happy with how his life was going. In his letter to the Philippians, he says this. He says, I have reason for confidence in the flesh. If anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. This is Paul's occasional bravado that comes out. But here he's telling us about who he was. Circumcised on the 8th day, right, in obedience with the law, good Jewish family, we would say. A member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. Here he doesn't say perfect. He doesn't say self-righteous. He just simply means as a Pharisee, he was very into law obedience. He had been trained in the interpretation of Jewish law. He probably tried to integrate law obedience into all aspects of his life. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church, right? You think I wasn't into it? I tried to snuff out other movements. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. Doesn't mean perfect, doesn't mean sinless. It just simply means I lived in accordance with the law. I did all the rituals, I did all the things, celebrated all of the holidays. There's a reputation about Paul sometimes that Paul was somehow burdened by a guilty conscience his whole life and was afraid of God until finally Paul meets Jesus and then discovers that God is gracious. Paul tells us here, right, that as a Jew, he understood the graciousness of God. He was not looking for a solution. He was not looking for a bigger and better Judaism of any kind. He was minding his own business, doing what he thought was the right thing when God encounters him. Whatever gains I had, right, whatever benefits, whatever assets I can claim, these I've come to regard as loss because of Christ, right, in comparison, not as important. Mustafa, can we run the microphone to you? That would be helpful. Thanks.
In the previous text and in this text, it says the church of God, and here a persecutor of the church.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean, considering that the first follower of Jesus, there was a sect of Jew, that means they used to meet in the synagogue. So in the original Greek, is that synagogue translated to church?
No, so it's a different word for synagogue and church. And so here the word for church is ekklesia, is the Greek word, which slipped into Latin as well. It just simply means assembly. So you might be part of an assembly of... Who is that assembly?
Yes. Are they Jewish or Gentile?
In this case, when he's talking about the church that he persecuted, was probably entirely Jewish. It's possible that there were a few Gentile converts before Paul started persecuting, but that doesn't fit with the plot in the book of Acts, for example. It doesn't seem to, hopefully that helps. Couple other things to note. I'm going to accelerate a little bit here. Paul had a Hellenistic education. That's in quotes. It just simply means a Greek-styled education. He speaks Greek. He quotes the Old Testament scriptures in Greek. He's familiar with Greek forms of rhetoric. We see that in his writing. He uses athletic imagery drawn from the Greco-Roman world. He uses language of citizenship and economics and things like that. These are not at odds, right? All Jews in the first century, almost all Jews in the first century, are also Hellenized, are also influenced by Greek culture and Greek education, right? It's not that he's got a split personality or something like that, but this is part of who he was. He obviously enjoys the resources, skills, benefactors, and cultural adaptability that you would need to travel in the ancient world. You need connections. You need to be able to set up a business. You need some money. So Paul's a person of some privilege compared to Jesus, quite a bit more in terms of what we can tell about both of those folks. Paul is also a part of a network of partners and associates. So we sometimes have this image of Paul as this lone figure, who's out there doing the good work, right? So he's often depicted like he is here with a sword, as if he's some kind of lone, warrior on behalf of Christ and of the church. Almost all of Paul's letters name co-authors. He often names friends that he's with, people he's working with. He often sends greetings to people. And part of his network of partners, this came up earlier, were actually women as well. So the image of Paul as, the image of Paul's misogyny, for example, right, also has to be tempered by this question of, Paul speaks quite fondly of a number of women who are engaged in Christian ministry. On the left here is Prisca. She and her husband Aquila are mentioned in a couple of letters attributed to Paul. They're mentioned in the book of Acts. This is a couple who live in Rome. They're Jewish. They're expelled from Rome for reasons that are lengthy, and are traveling missionaries like Paul. One of the curious things about them, Prisca's name is often mentioned first, which was unusual in the ancient world, might suggest that she has higher social status than her husband. It might also suggest that she's the more prominent or more gifted of the two as a speaker or teacher or preacher. In the middle, we have Junia. In the book of Romans, or Paul's letter to the Romans, he names Junia as one of the apostles. This is a little bit of a surprise to a lot of folks that there could be a woman who's named among the apostles. Paul praises her and somebody named Andronicus as prominent among the apostles, or noteworthy among the apostles. Phoebe, on the right there, is the one who carries the letter to Rome, the letter to the Romans, to the church in Rome. He says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, refers to her as a deacon in the church in Cenchreae, which is near Corinth. Hard to find art on these people, but there's two women, Euodia and Syntyche, who are in Philippi, who Paul refers to, who appear to be two church leaders of different groups in Philippi. There's others as well that he names. So he's part of this bigger network. We can add to this people like Timothy and Silas and Titus and other folks who Paul names. So don't think of him as the only one who's out there doing this work. He's the guy who wrote the letters, all right? And that's one of the reasons why that we know him and know his name. A couple other things. He's aware of Christian traditions and their roots in the life and ministry of Jesus. He occasionally will quote liturgical formulas like baptismal formulas or confessions, a reminder again that he's not coming up with all of these ideas solely on his own. He's also informed by some of the teachings in the wider church. At the same time, his teaching is focused mostly on what happens through the death and resurrection of Jesus and the gift of the Holy Spirit. In other words, Paul never talks about parables that Jesus preached, never talks about the healings that Jesus performs, doesn't talk about things like the Sermon on the Mount. Paul is really focused on what is God doing through the death and resurrection of Jesus. This is really significant to him because one of the things he's convinced that God is doing through the death and resurrection of Jesus is bringing in the Gentiles. And so he talks a couple of places about his sense of his own calling as an apostle sent to the Gentiles, to non-Jews. This is dramatic for Paul. This is really the heart of his, it's not necessarily his big idea, but where he's on the cutting edge of the church's work in the middle of the first century, is he understands what God is doing through Jesus Christ as not just good news for Jewish people, but also now for the rest of the wider world. And Paul sees the presence of the Holy Spirit in these Christian communities, and most of the communities he's working with are predominantly Gentile, as signs that these people are now full members in the family of God, in the communion of saints. In other words, Paul is adamant that Gentiles do not need to become law obedient or Torah obedient in order to be fully accepted into God's good grace. So Paul, as a Jew, is breaking down a very significant barrier, this very significant value judgment between Jew and Gentile that he sees as somehow wiped out in God's act of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and in God's willingness to distribute the Holy Spirit to all of these churches. It's a dramatic argument. It's amazing how it won, so to speak, right? If you imagine Torah obedience having always been part of Jewish identity, always part of what it meant for a non-Jew to convert into Judaism, and now the church, not just because of Paul, but because of other people who are doing work among Gentile congregations, are insisting the law is not a necessary requirement. Paul frames this as freedom, right? He says there's nothing that holds you back, nothing that you have to do to make you worthy of divine grace. This is the universalizing aspect of Paul's ministry. Now, he does this quite well among the Jew and Gentile distinction. There are other distinctions in the ancient world, one among slaves and slave owners, or slaves and free people, that Paul appears uninterested in addressing. We'll come back to that in later weeks. Distinctions between men and women, which are deeply controlled in a lot of Roman social norms. It's not clear if Paul is pressing against those or not. Again, he's got partners in ministry who are women, but he also occasionally says some things that make it sound like he has no interest in making space for women to exercise their gifts in Christian communities. So this isn't to say, when I talk about Paul and freedom, this is not to kind of say Paul has got it. But the one kind of dividing line, the one fault line that Paul is really, really devoted to spending his time in, Paul is a tireless advocate for these Gentile congregations. Could you run to the back for me, Claire? Thank you so much. Betty's got a comment or question.
Thank you. To that point, my father always reminded us that women should be silent in church. That's something I heard all growing up. And I was curious earlier, because we don't see Paul, on the one hand, you say there are women that were part of that network around that whole very large area that he traveled. But back to Corinthians and Galatians, I was curious about where he begins with brothers and sisters. Yeah. Probably the first place that we put an order to gender, but because I've been fighting to get sisters and brothers in there for a while. But I'm curious about the words. Are we looking at Paul's letters? Where are they today? And when we read the language in which he wrote, what did it say?
Yeah, so all of those that I read earlier, where it says brothers and sisters, in the Greek there, it's the word for brothers.
Thank you. I thought it might be editorializing later on and expanding the understanding of women and the role of women in this
is coming
tradition.
From the, it's a newer English translation. This is the editors of the New Revised Standard Version who in 1988-ish, somewhere around there, wherever they see, like either whether it's men or in this case brothers, if it seems clear that the author or the speaker is addressing all y'all, added the and sisters. Or. You mean or instead of and?
Or, rather than that he's talking to all, he's actually talking to men. That was primarily his audience. And today, that's not who's in the room.
Yeah, some of that depends. So like when Paul is, like in the book of Acts where Paul is preaching, sometimes he even starts off sermons with men brothers, like the Greek has got both of them. And that's probably because like who's out in public in the temple, in public spaces. When Paul's writing to these churches, there's an interesting line at the end of what might be his first letter, the first that we have. He does say that he wants this letter read to the whole church, which ostensibly could include everybody, right? So he understands the letter is not just, to a couple of people. His letter to Philemon is also addressed to Apphia, who's, I believe, named as his wife, or if not, she could be wife or sister. But and the church that meets in their house. So, I mean, there are a couple of places where there's some indications that he does recognize women in the room. But a letter like Galatians, which really focuses in on circumcision, for example, it appears Paul's forgotten half of the congregation, right? Because circumcision is obviously not an issue. So some of it's place to place, right? There are a couple of places, too. There, in the book of Acts, for example, where it describes Paul persecuting people, it does say that he has authority to arrest both men and women, and that's an interesting place where actually both those words appear in the Greek, which is significant, right? Because if you're persecuting the church, you're probably going to go after visible people or leadership people or something. And so every now and then there are some reminders that there are some ancient authors who recognize that the church is not all male. But some of that is, again, that later addition. It's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but yeah, Mark, sorry.
So your last line up there, you have Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. I'm sure you must have speculated on this question. Without Paul, does Christianity become a church that allows Gentiles?
Yeah, it's a good question. Without Paul, does Christianity become a church that allows Gentiles? I think yes, just because we have evidence that other people are preaching in Gentile communities and helping to found them. There's a church in Rome that Paul has not visited that appears to be large and thriving that he writes to. So I think there's evidence that there's other people. The book of Acts gives testimony to that. What we would lose if we didn't have Paul's letters is that full-throated theological defense of God's grace being without condition, whether that's Torah observance or anything else, that grace is the great leveler, so to speak, that not that nobody else was teaching that, but Paul's letters are the New Testament documents that give voice to that in a way similar to some things that Jesus says. But remember, Jesus' ministry is primarily among Jews. There's very few Gentiles in the Gospels. Mustafa.
I would like to contribute with the Quranic perspective,
Sure.
speaking about Gentile. According to the Quran, Muhammad is the messenger to the whole world, Jew and Gentile.
Yeah.
Because in the Quran there is this dichotomy between Gentile and people of the book. So the Gentile, in another names, they are called al-Ummiyin, which means the unscriptured. They don't have a previous scriptures because all the messengers, they was from the people, Jewish people ethnically. Not only adherent to Judaism, but ethnically. And since Jesus was a Jew, Muhammad as a Gentile prophet to the whole humanity, telling the Jewish people that Jesus Christ is your Messiah, and he was born from Virgin Mary, and he ascended to God, and he is alive, and he is coming at the end of the time. So, and telling to the Gentile, which are the Arabs and other people from other ethnicity, including the Roman, called the believers, not the Christians. And when the Quran mentions Nasara, it doesn't mean the Gentile Christian. It means only the Jewish sect following a book called the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, so you're opening up some of the ways in which it's complicated. So even around the time of Paul and after, we've got, as best we can tell, there are Jewish communities of people who follow Jesus who are law obedient. Peter would appear to be one of those. You've got Jewish people who are following Jesus who are no longer Torah obedient. Paul appears to be one of those people. You've got Gentile communities that are law obedient. You've got Gentile communities of Jesus followers who are not law obedient. So at least those four, they don't all agree with each other. You've got some Gentile groups who are mad at all of them because these people appear to be strange. You've got Jewish groups who are not following Jesus. So, I mean, you've got, and this in some ways starts to iron itself out by the time we get to around the year 200. So we're still far before Muhammad then. But we do have a variety of groups and different ways in which Christianity is still negotiating what proper Christian practice looks like, and what the church's relationship to Judaism looks like. So that's fascinating that still is kind of, those distinctions are still alive, right, as Islam is being born. Sounds familiar? There's churches that don't agree, and that, yeah, it's crazy. Imagine that. I could say a lot there, but I'm going to a couple of other quick things. Just about Paul as a letter writer. I'll refer you to Beverly Gaventa's video about Paul not being a systematic theologian. Paul doesn't sit in the library and think up big thoughts and write them down. He doesn't get paid for that. He doesn't have tenure. But Paul is... Paul's theology comes out in the work of the churches, right? He's working with congregations that have no owner's manual, no list of best practices, no clear structures for leadership, and is trying to continue to inform them kind of as things develop. And some of these communions are doing great. Some he's deeply worried about because they're fragile and they appear to be suffering some kind of persecution. Some are just acting like jerks towards each other. This is 1 Corinthians. He's a little furious with them because of the ways in which they're inscribing their own sense of advantages within their community as well. So Paul thinks theologically, of course, but we never get a full presentation of his theology. And the fact that he writes letters, I find just kind of delightfully ordinary. Anybody could write a letter in the ancient world. If you had somebody who could write and knew somebody on the other end could read, and if you knew somebody who could deliver it for you, right? There is no mail service. You need somebody reliable. But Paul uses an ordinary technology, an ordinary medium of his time to communicate with his churches, to try to lend his presence to them from a distance, right? It's kind of leadership by surrogacy or leadership by correspondence with Paul. And we'll see that in the letters that are coming up. So today, by design, is kind of more of an invitation just to kind of say, let's see who we see in these letters, knowing that Paul has a lot to commend him and a lot that sometimes makes people want to tear their hair out. I share those things. But just a really quick overview about where we're going. There are 13 letters in the New Testament that bear Paul's name, that are attributed to Paul. And here are 7 of them in order of how they appear in the New Testament. The New Testament actually sorts the letters by length. Not how I would have done it, but the longest letter, Romans, comes first. The shortest letter, Philemon, comes last. The only exception to that is when there's 2 letters paired together, like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, those get matched together. So there's no magic in the sequence. It's literally longest to shortest for the most part. Those are only 7 of them. There's also these as well. And there are debates about the ones in the right-hand column about who really wrote them. They bear Paul's name, but it's possible that they were written by a follower of Paul, perhaps somebody he commissioned to write for him. It's possible they were written after his death by one of his followers. That sounds to us like forgery. In the ancient world, it was not entirely accepted, but in some conditions, in some settings, it was a much more accepted practice to write in the name of a beloved teacher or leader or figure who had passed away. This is stuff we'll get into later, but biblical scholarship is great for really horrible labels for things, and so just not creative labels, right? So we tend to refer to the ones on the left as the undisputed letters, and you guessed it, the ones on the right as the disputed letters. Not disputing the contents necessarily. There are good things and hard things in all of these letters in either column. This is just about the authorship. The 7 on the left-hand column bear remarkable similarity in terms of their style, vocabulary, theology, perspective. Hardly anybody doubts that a different person wrote those. Among scholars, there's some debates. Ephesians and Colossians bear a lot in common. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus bear a lot in common. That's why I've grouped those. We're not going to get to that until well into the spring, but just so you know, there are some questions about what's coming from Paul's own mouth, Paul's own pen, his followers, and things like that. Well, that's a big question for 1014. I thought there'd be some discussion here. I'm going to leave you with this then, just a long passage, but just something to sit with as you grab coffee and transition to church or to your car, wherever you're walking home, whatever you're doing next. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. Here you get a sense of Paul's universalism, right? Paul's sense of wherever the Spirit goes, that's where God is. Whoever the Spirit inhabits, that's whom God has accepted, right? For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, Abba is the Aramaic name for father, Aramaic word for father. It's that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. In other words, Paul is saying here, just our capacity to refer to God as our parent, as our divine parent, is a kind of expression of our identity as children of God. And so he sees us as adopted children, people who have been or become heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. Adoption was a really big thing in the Roman world, still is today, but adoption was a really big thing in terms of how people would pass along their legacy, their imperium, their majesty. You might know Julius Caesar adopts Octavian, who becomes Augustus as the first emperor, adopts him as his son. There's novels. There are kind of these popular novels that have these like adoption fantasies. You know how we have movies about like people who win the lottery, right? This is the dream, right? I'm going to win Powerball and get like $100 million. And what was the movie about there's a village in Ireland, right, where some Waking Ned Divine, right? This guy dies and he's got the winning lottery ticket, and the village has to like put on this ruse, to get all the money. Like this idea of being adopted by somebody famous was a